The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is going to welcome you to the FSMA Final Rule on Pre-Harvest Agricultural Water webinar. I'm Mike Kaczynski, along with my colleague Lauren Finnegan, will be hosting today's event. Today's event is recorded, captioned, and will also be posted on FDA's website and YouTube page. Let's get started as I hand it off to Jim Jones, Deputy Commissioner for Human Foods. Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're situated. I'm pleased to be able to join today's call. First, I want to extend my appreciation to the FDA team that has been working for many years on the Agricultural Water Rule. Your hard work and dedication to address stakeholder concerns has resulted in a regulatory approach that provides the necessary public health protections while offering the flexibility needed for implementation. Thanks is also due to our many stakeholders joining today. Your feedback and ongoing dialogue were essential to our being able to identify the revised strategy. I believe the shift to a systems-based approach will result in better compliance with the rule and a safer food supply, bringing us one step closer to making foodborne illness outbreaks a thing of the past. Through this rulemaking, we are leading the world in laying out a system for assessing potential hazards that could impact the safety of water used on produce prior to harvest, and a risk-tiered approach for addressing those hazards. The revised requirements also provide sufficient adaptability over time where there are advancements in science and technology. All of this you will be hearing more about in greater detail today. Over the next several months, we are working on advancing our programs to support successful implementation of the requirements of this rule. As with other FSMA rules, we plan to continue our educate before and while we regulate posture as we begin implementing the pre-harvest requirements. We will also be building on what has worked for other aspects of the produce safety rule implementation. This means we'll be looking to work closely with state, other regulatory partners, educators, extension agents, and industry partners to advance training, technical assistance, guidance and other tools, educational visits, and on-farm readiness reviews. My team recently kicked off the newly developed Integrated Food Safety System Regulatory and Laboratory Training System. This new training system leverages the expertise and resources of all IFSS partners to ensure not only that our integrated workforce has the necessary competencies, but that we are able to expand training capacity and availability. As we move forward, we welcome the continued engagement of stakeholders to ensure that we are providing you with the necessary support. Our focus is on ensuring your success. We know that implementing changes to meet the regulatory requirements while maintaining operations is challenging, and we are committed to having open lines of communication and to providing guidance and offering resources to support your successful implementation of the agricultural water requirements. Again, thanks to all of you for helping us reach this milestone. I am confident with the dedication and commitment of our agricultural producers, FDA staff, and state and international regulatory partners, we will advance our goal of preventing foodborne illness outbreaks and ensure that the U.S. food supply is safe and nutritious. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon regarding the Ag Water Final Rule requirements. My name is Kruti Ravalia, and I'm a Consumer Safety Officer at the Food and Drug Administration within the Division of Produce Safety at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Today, we'll be talking about a variety of topics regarding the Final Produce Safety Rule Ag Water subpart. We'll start with an overview of the final rule. We'll talk about some of the comments that were received to the proposal. We'll talk about the specifics of the rule requirements, compliance dates, and then supporting materials that FDA has developed to support the final rule publication. At a high level, the overview of the final rule is that the rule establishes requirements for comprehensive systems-based assessments conducted at least once per year that focus on key determinants of risk associated with pre-harvest agricultural water that's intended to or likely to contact covered produce other than sprouts. As I'll discuss later on, this includes consideration for the water system, water use practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and other relevant factors. The rule also establishes a framework for assessment outcomes that require timely action based on the risk that's been identified. This includes a new requirement for expedited mitigations related to certain hazards that are associated with adjacent and nearby land uses. We developed these rule requirements in light of new science demonstrating limitations that are associated with the previous pre-harvest testing water testing requirements, findings from investigations of several produce-related outbreaks, and feedback from a variety of stakeholders, including through comments submitted to the proposed rule. We've designed this approach to achieve improved public health protections while also being more feasible to implement across the wide variety of agricultural water systems, uses, and practices. And we've designed these requirements to be adaptable to future scientific advancements. Just as a reminder, the requirements for the produce safety rule in general continue to apply, regardless of status with Subpart E. We received roughly 180 comments from farms, trade organizations, academia, consumer groups, and other government agencies, among others. Most of these comments were generally supportive of the rule compared to the previous pre-harvest agricultural water testing requirements that commenters found to be one-size-fits-all. Some comments requested clarity on topics such as how to manage hazards that are outside of the farm's control. Many comments also requested additional guidance on the requirements for assessments and outcomes. We're finalizing the rule largely as proposed with minor modifications for additional clarity. This includes clarifying that an exemption only applies if water quality is unlikely to change prior to use. This also includes revising the mitigations related to in-field and post-harvest die-off to better allow for future advancements in science and post-harvest handling practices. In response to stakeholder comments, we also provide additional information on the requirements throughout the rule. The rule requires that at the beginning of the growing season, but at least once annually, farms must evaluate various factors that are key determinants of risk associated with pre-harvest agricultural water. This includes an evaluation of the agricultural water system, such as the agricultural water source, distribution system, and the degree of protection from possible sources of contaminants, agricultural water use practices, such as the timing and method of water application, and crop characteristics, such as the susceptibility of the produce to adhesion or internalization of hazards. This also includes environmental conditions, such as heavy rains, extreme weather events, air temperatures, and UV exposure that may impact water systems or covered produce. Lastly, the category of other relevant factors includes any additional information that a grower would take into account when assessing the water source and system. This would include results of agricultural water testing to further inform the assessment. When conducting the assessment, farms must document those assessments, and the assessments must be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. Findings from farms' agricultural water assessments are used to inform what measures are needed and by when to reduce the risks that are associated with pre-harvest agricultural water. Specifically, if water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, the farm must immediately discontinue use of the water and implement corrective measures prior to resuming its use. Once a grower conducts the assessment and captures the information based on those elements that were previously described, growers would then make determinations on outcomes of the assessment. Starting at the blue box on top, a grower would evaluate the nature of the water source and distribution system, the degree of protection of the water source and system, how the water is used on farm, the type of crop that's being grown, any environmental conditions, as well as other relevant factors, which may include water quality testing. Based on all of that information collectively, the grower would then make the first determination, starting at the first red box on top. The grower will determine whether or not the water is safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. If the water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, the grower must then immediately discontinue use of that water and implement a corrective measure as soon as possible before resuming use of that water. If the grower determines instead that the water is safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, but there are hazards present in that water source, which are related to adjacent and nearby land uses, such as the use of biological soil amendments of animal origin, untreated or improperly treated human waste, or animal activities, then the grower would need to identify whether or not a mitigation needs to be implemented. And if those hazards are related to adjacent and nearby land uses, they would then implement a mitigation measure as soon as practicable, but no later than the following season. Instead, if a grower identifies hazards that are not related to those previously described adjacent and nearby land uses, again, animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or untreated or improperly treated human waste, they would then determine whether or not they could implement a mitigation measure as soon as practicable, but no later than the following year, or as long as it doesn't preclude any immediate public health action, the grower could conduct water quality testing to further inform that ag water assessment to perhaps better implement a mitigation measure that's more relevant to the hazards that are identified. If no hazards are identified, then the grower would continue on to the green box at the bottom, where they continue to regularly inspect and maintain their agricultural water source and distribution system and conduct assessments once annually. As part of an assessment, farms are required to consider adjacent and nearby land uses that are related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and untreated or improperly treated human waste. This can include consideration for the nature of the water system, which also includes the proximity of the potential hazards and surrounding topography, fencing or containment or other measures that might reduce animal access to the water system, and any type of berm or physical barrier that might help reduce the influence of runoff into the water system. The presence of an adjacent or nearby land use does not always mean that a mitigation measure will be required. Implementing a mitigation measure is based on the accumulation of information that's associated with the assessment. If a farm determines that mitigation measures are necessary in response to certain adjacent and nearby land uses, the rule requires that they implement those measures on an expedited basis. Specifically, farms must implement those measures promptly and within the same growing season as the assessment. We included this requirement in light of findings from several investigations related to produce outbreaks, highlighting the role that adjacent and nearby lands can play on agricultural water quality. Further, the rule explains that there are measures that farms can use to manage the risks, regardless of whether a source of hazards is outside of their control. For example, depending on the circumstances, a farm may be able to build a berm to reduce runoff into their water system or change the water application method to reduce the potential of contamination of their produce. As for testing that's done to further inform an assessment, the rule incorporates flexibility to account for future scientific developments. For example, farms that test their pre-harvest agricultural water as a part of an assessment may test for generic E. coli or for any other scientifically valid organism or analyte. The rule also requires farms to establish and use a sampling frequency and microbial criteria that are appropriate to assist them in determining whether a mitigation is needed. Farms are required to have appropriate scientific justification to support the sampling and microbial analysis that they conduct. Testing is required as part of an assessment when doing so would not delay the most critical public health action and would further inform a farm's assessment. While not required, farms may choose to use the sampling framework and microbial criteria for pre-harvest water in the 2015 Produce Safety Rule. This consisted of a geometric mean of 126 or less CFU, generic E. coli, per 100 mils, and a statistical threshold value of 410 or less CFU, generic E. coli, per 100 mils. And for untreated surface water, for example, this consisted of collecting at least 5 samples every year to establish a multi-year rolling water quality profile. Importantly, the rule emphasizes that test results are to be considered as part of the assessment, not as a standalone basis for decision-making. The rule specifies 2 different types of measures for managing risks associated with pre-harvest agricultural water: corrective measures and mitigation measures. Corrective measures are used in circumstances where immediate action is necessary to protect public health, specifically when water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. The farm is required to immediately discontinue use of that water and implement a corrective measure prior to resuming its use. Conversely, mitigation measures provide more flexibility in timing of decisions. As discussed earlier, the timing of mitigations will depend on the nature of the hazards that are in question. Consistent with the 2015 final rule, this rule outlines corrective measures that farms can implement if their pre-harvest agricultural water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. These include re-inspecting the water system to the extent that it is under the farm's control, identifying conditions that may introduce hazards, and making the necessary changes, and then determining that those changes were effective, or treating the water in accordance with the requirements of the rule. If a farm determines that mitigation measures are necessary, there are various measures available for them to use. For example, a farm could make necessary changes such as repairs, use a pre-harvest or post-harvest time interval, or some other post-harvest activity that results in microbial die-off or removal with appropriate scientific justification, or the grower could choose to treat the water. We've also added 2 mitigation measures compared to the 2015 rule to provide additional flexibility in the ways that farms can manage risks that are associated with their pre-harvest agricultural water. These include changing the water application method, such as by changing from an overhead spray to a drip irrigation for certain crops, or taking alternative measures. If the farm fails to implement an appropriate mitigation measure or determines that their mitigation measures were not effective, they must immediately discontinue use of the agricultural water. In situations where growers may be concerned that inspectors or investigators may not arrive at the same outcome decision as the grower once they've conducted the assessment, we anticipate that there will be education and outreach to ensure that inspectors, investigators, and farmers arrive at similar decisions. This will be a learning process and it will take time, but FDA intends to work together with stakeholders to be able to clearly identify ways to implement the requirements for the ag water rule. Farms must conduct an assessment at least once annually and whenever a significant change occurs. Examples of significant changes include, but are not limited to, changes that are related to the agricultural water system, such as a change in the water source or installation of a new distribution system. Water use practices, such as the changing of a method or timing of application. In situations where reassessment occurs, a farm must conduct an assessment to capture a change in the previous assessment. So growers that are conducting annual assessments once a year or whenever a significant change occurs would capture information related to the agricultural water system and the possible changes that may be associated with that system, including how the water is being used and whether or not there's a change, perhaps related from groundwater use to surface water use, a change in water use practices, such as the timing or method of application of agricultural water, growing certain types of covered produce or a different type of covered produce, and whether or not there are any environmental conditions, such as unexpected flooding that might introduce hazards to a water source. The reassessment must evaluate the impacts of those changes on the assessment factors, any new hazards that are identified, and the outcome and determination for whether corrective or mitigation measures are reasonably necessary. An exemption from the assessment requirements may apply if water meets certain requirements that apply to harvest and post-harvest water use, including the microbial criterion, prohibition on the use of untreated surface water, and relevant testing requirements for untreated groundwater. An exemption may also apply if water is received from a public water system or supply and the farm has documentation showing that the relevant requirements are met. A farm may also be eligible for an exemption if they treat the water in accordance with the rule requirements and meet all relevant requirements, including those for record keeping. Additionally, it must be reasonably likely that the quality of the water will not change prior to use of the water. For example, water quality may change due to the manner in which it is held, stored, or conveyed. We're finalizing the compliance dates for the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements staggered based on farm size, beginning 9 months after the effective date of the rule for the largest farms, which will be 11 months after publication. Compliance for the largest of farms will begin on April 7th, 2025. Small farms on April 6th, 2026. The effective date of this rulemaking is July 5th, 2024. You'll see that the dates change over the years, but each of those compliance dates begins on a Monday. As has been done with our other FSMA rules, FDA plans to educate before and while we regulate, and to work closely with our state partners and the produce industry to implement these changes. We recognize that education, outreach, and technical assistance will be key as farms work towards compliance with these requirements. Information on the rule is available on our website, including educational resources such as fact sheets. With the release of the final rule, we've also updated our online agricultural water assessment builder to assist farms in understanding and complying with the new requirements. Further, we will be working closely with state regulators, NASDA, educators, and others to provide the necessary training to implement these changes to the agricultural water requirements. There are a variety of resources available to stakeholders if you have questions about the rule, including our FSMA Technical Assistance Network and Produce Safety Network. If you have questions, or if you'd like FDA to speak at one of your engagements or conferences, please submit your requests to the AgWater inbox at agwater@fda.hhs.gov. And now I'd like to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you for that presentation, Kruti. Now we'll be starting our question and answer session, where our panelists will be answering questions that were submitted during the registration process and some from our chat as well. First, I'd like to introduce our panel members.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Chris Brown. I work in the fresh produce branch as a hydrologist on the policy side.
Yes, hello everyone. Hi, I'm Chelsea Davidson. I work for FDA's Office of Food Policy and Response. And I've worked with the AgWater team on water since pretty much around when the 2015 final rule published. So yeah, same as Chris, glad to be here.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Thomas. I am a senior advisor in the Office of the Center Director at CFSAN. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And lastly on our panel, we have again, Kruti Ravalia, who you all know from the presentation. So let's jump right into it. For our first question, we have, what are the main differences between the final rule and the 2015 final rule?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot, actually, Lauren, thank you. So this rule replaces the pre-harvest microbial quality criteria and testing requirements that were published in 2015. And so instead of those criteria and testing frequency requirements, we now require growers to conduct an assessment that's risk-based, and using the information captured in this assessment, growers would then make management decisions based on the outcome of based on the information captured, and then the outcome would be related to the specific hazards that are identified. Instead of requiring a long-term microbial testing profile for water sources, growers would now take this sort of comprehensive approach to evaluating water, which could include water quality testing. The rule doesn't revise the requirements that apply for harvest and post-harvest water use, nor does it change the requirements that are broadly applicable to all agricultural water. However, some of the provision numbers have been updated based on the publication of this rulemaking. And in Table 3 of the final rule, we do summarize the key changes that have been made along with the location of those changes for the provisions, if it's helpful for stakeholders to see.
All right, thanks, Kruti. Next, we have, since surface water sources are inherently exposed to potential sources of hazards, does that mean that mitigation will always be required?
Yeah, so if a grower is using surface water, it doesn't necessarily mean that a mitigation measure is going to be necessary. The risks that's associated with surface water depends on the likelihood of a hazard being introduced. So for example, if a farm has two different holding ponds, one may be at a higher elevation than the other. The pond that's at the higher elevation may be better protected from runoff than the pond that's at the lower elevation. Whether or not a mitigation measure is necessary also depends on the rest of the information that's captured in the assessment, including how the water is used, the crop that's being grown, any relevant environmental conditions. And evaluating all of this information as a whole is how a grower is going to make determination about appropriate management strategies.
Very great, thank you. Please provide examples of conditions in which exemptions will be approved, meaning what conditions will be considered adequate for an approved exemption?
So exemptions are, there's three categories of exemptions. One in which a water source is received from a public water system. And that water would meet the requirements for the Safe Drinking Water Act, meaning that it's no detectable generic E. coli, among other requirements. And then in order to be eligible for that exemption, the grower must also demonstrate a certificate of compliance showing that the water meets those Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, as well as ensuring that the quality of the water doesn't change. So you're maintaining the quality of the water from the time that you're receiving it to the point of use. So with respect to receiving a municipal water source, for example, there wouldn't be any type of holding for that water that would introduce potential contaminants, such as from runoff or something like that. Other categories of exemptions would include water that's treated, with additional stipulations, again, ensuring that the water quality doesn't change. And then if water is untreated, groundwater is being used for harvest and post-harvest activities, and that water continues to meet the no detectable generic E. coli, that water can be used as part of surface water activities that may be exempt from conducting the assessment. But again, there's stipulations around these exemptions. They're not sort of blanket without any caveat.
And this is Chelsea. If I can add just one thing, we also need to keep in mind when thinking about exemptions that the records requirements will still apply. So records related to treatment, farm will need to have those on hand in order to be eligible for an exemption. Same as for the harvest, post-harvest testing requirements for untreated groundwater. And then also, like Crudy had mentioned, that certificate of compliance for water from a public water system.
All right, thanks for that addition, Chelsea. Under what circumstances are farms required to test their water as part of an assessment?
If you choose not to implement a mitigation measure after making your determination of the assessment, then you would be required to conduct water quality testing to further inform that assessment in making an informed management strategy for that water source. And so that's one situation where water quality testing would be required. Chelsea, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so that testing requirement really kicks in when testing wouldn't delay the action that's most critical to protect public health, and like Crudy mentioned, would also help to inform your assessment. So one example where testing would not kick in would be if your water is not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. So this would be situations like where if there's dead and decaying animals in your water or a leakage of raw sewage, no amount of testing would overcome a finding of that water not being okay. So that's why we haven't required testing in all circumstances.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Is there a guidance format for the assessment?
A guidance format, meaning is there something that will help a grower walk through conducting the assessment? I'm hoping that the person who asked the question is still available to respond to this question. If that's the case, the Ag Water Assessment Builder does walk a grower through conducting the assessment. So all of the information that's in the codified has been sort of put into this user-friendly format for the Ag Water Assessment Builder online, and it walks the grower through step-by-step, capturing all the relevant information that would be required for an assessment.
Also from the chat, can you explain the differences in 112.42 and this assessment?
Yeah, so the requirements under 112.42 are related specifically to the inspection and maintenance of a water source, and not necessarily taking the information that is captured through the assessment. So the assessment is broader than the inspections and maintenance for the water source and distribution system that's covered under 112.42. Once you conduct the inspection and maintenance of your water source and distribution system, you take that information and use it as part of the assessment. So knowing whether or not knowing the status of that water source and distribution system, whether there's maintenance that needs to be done to it, whether there's any type of work that needs to be done, for example, to your well casing, whether it needs to be done any work around the well head, the cement pad around there. And taking that information in conjunction with all of the additional information that's outlined under 112.43. So the assessment under 112.43 is broader and encompasses information captured under 112.42. Chelsea, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, just another key difference. So those requirements in 112.42 for inspections and maintenance, those also apply to all agricultural water, not just pre-harvest water that's used for non-sprout covered produce. Another big difference between those and the assessment is that the inspection and maintenance requirements aren't directly tied to corrective or mitigation measures. Of course, you might uncover something in doing those requirements, but it does differ from the assessments with the risk-based outcomes where we have, based on your findings from the assessment, that kind of dictates what your next steps are. So similar, but slightly different.
All right, great, thank you. Will the outcomes flowchart be available for distribution?
Yes, it should actually be available on the website right now. It's under the supporting materials, I believe, at the bottom of the Ag Water Final Rule page.
All right. Next, what are you deeming as not safe or adequately sanitary quality?
So Chelsea gave a few examples of that a couple of questions ago, where she said there was a dead or decaying animal in the water source. There's human sewage that's dripping into water source. Those are examples of situations in which water would not be considered safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. It's this public health threat, clear public health threat.
It will, in general, be a matter of all of the factors that you're looking at as part of an assessment when going through your pre-harvest water. While there are some circumstances like that where it is or should be kind of glaringly obvious that there is an issue with the water, there might be other circumstances that are a bit less clear cut, where you have a potential hazard there. And then depending on, how and when you use your water, what the environmental conditions are, things like that, that would really then dictate whether the water does meet that threshold for being not safe and not of adequate sanitary quality.
All right, thank you. Another question that we got from registration: if I perform an agricultural water assessment and test my water, and the test results show that the water meets the GM and STV criteria from the 2015 rule, does that mean mitigation measures aren't needed?
So again, test results should not be used as a standalone for decision making. So instead, these test results that you have would serve as an additional source of information that a grower would use alongside the rest of the information that's captured from this assessment. So for example, if water meets those criteria, trends in water quality over time may highlight changes that are occurring to that water source that could point to contamination. And this information, along with the others, would point a little bit further in applying more effective mitigation measures. And so it's this comprehensive data package, not just water quality testing alone, but water quality testing can show additional information that can help a grower manage the water source and distribution system, how it's used on farm.
What guidance and/or research is available to help farmers determine crop characteristics?
So there's some data out there for some crops that shows that there could be internalization or surface adhesion of pathogens onto the surface of the crop, but it's not broadly available for all crops. And so this is one of those areas where we see that there is some science, and we anticipate that there's going to be more science. And so if there is data available that indicates that there may be something about the crop that's being grown that makes it more prone to surface adhesions or internalization of pathogens, then take that information into consideration. And when more science becomes available, continue to take that information into consideration.
One thing I did want to take a chance to clarify is that the coverage of the produce safety rule in general continues to apply for this. This is just one subset of requirements in the whole produce safety rule. So everything about, covered produce, farm size, all of that still kicks in, still applies. This does not change anything for those.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I just want to remind everybody again, as Chelsea mentioned, everything with the produce safety rule still applies. This ag water subpart is a piece of the produce safety rule. So while we had requirements in 2015 that were published as part of the produce safety rule, these would then replace that as the agricultural water requirements. So it's not intended to be a standalone rule. It's part of the produce safety rule.
What is the FDA distinction between promptly and as soon as possible? Are these defined? And if so, where can they be found?
So with respect to mitigation measures that must be implemented promptly and as soon as practicable or within the same growing season, the outer bound on that timeline is within the same growing season. Promptly would be when it's feasible, but the outer bound on that is again within the same growing season. And I think those were the times that were referenced in the question, right?
Yeah, and if I can just add really quickly, so the reason that we've kind of included that flexibility in timing is recognizing that some of those mitigation measures will take time and resources to implement. So for example, if you have to change any part of your water system, make repairs, that's not necessarily something that can be done overnight, an immediate quick fix. So that's kind of why we've included that, no later than the same growing season. However, the expectation is that farms will not wait until that second time period. So that's why we've included that promptly, because it's really, when you're able to, when it's feasible, that's when it needs to be done to protect public health.
If I'm using city water, which is tested and recorded, can I use their test results, or do we need to conduct our own testing?
So again, if you're using water from a municipal source with respect to the exemption, you may be exempt from conducting an agricultural water assessment pending those other caveats that water quality doesn't change prior to the point of receipt and then at the point of use. But you must keep that record from your municipality stating that the water meets the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act, or whatever the documentation is saying that the water is in compliance. With respect to the requirement to test, again, the requirement to test would only be in situations where it's not a public health threat, when there are no hazards that are associated with adjacent and nearby land uses, and when that testing can be used to further inform the assessment. And so I think there's two pieces to that question. Do I need to do testing? And am I exempt from testing if I receive water from a public water system? So hopefully that addresses the question.
The red, orange, and yellow chart is characterized in the preamble as a risk-based outcome system. Can you describe why, in that structural paradigm for corrective measures and timing of mitigation measures, conditions related to animal activities, BSAAO, and human waste are in the lower risk response category compared to those same conditions on nearby or adjacent lands?
So the risk ranking for the adjacent and nearby land uses and those activities that are related to adjacent and nearby land uses is when those are not on your farm. If those activities are happening adjacent and nearby to your lands and they're not on your farm, then they're not activities that are captured under other requirements of the produce safety rule. And so you may not know about the specific nature of those activities, those possible hazards, and how that can introduce contaminants into your system. And so that's why they're required to have an expedited mitigation implementation timeline as compared to those same activities on farm. With biological soil amendments of animal origin, for example, that's covered by subpart F in the produce safety rule. And so, that would be something that theoretically you are aware of on your farm and you are managing in a way that it doesn't serve as a source or route of contamination to your produce.
What treatments are accepted if there is not a single sanitizer with an EPA label to treat human pathogens on irrigation water? Arizona is the only state that has one temporary permit for a PAA sanitizer. How is this going to be approached internationally?
So the two parts to the question: how do you use a sanitizer if there isn't one that's approved? And then the international component. So the first part, how are you going to apply a sanitizer if there hasn't been one that's approved? So FDA and EPA have worked together to develop a test protocol to evaluate the effectiveness of a chemical that can be used in pre-harvest agricultural water. And so while there isn't one that's approved currently, there are plans to have those chemical treatments available in the future, and that protocol paves the way to get to that point. And then with regards to international, the growers that are using chemistries for treating agricultural water would be required to follow what is outlined by their government requirements. And so EPA jurisdiction doesn't cover the international stakeholder community, but as long as those chemistries that are being used must be used in accordance with their label to ensure that it's being used effectively.
And
all right.
Sorry,
go ahead, Chelsea.
Item regarding the international piece. So there are different regulations that are in place, such as tolerances on products that are coming into the country. It's a bit broader in scope than this presentation, so I don't think we'll go into details, but there are other regulations that are in place to make sure that those are being used safely.
Can you give an example of an acceptable response to answer the degree of protection?
So I guess we can talk a little bit more about degree of protection, but I'm not sure specifically what this question is getting at. So if a water source, for example, earlier as I described, that there's a pond at a higher elevation and a pond at a lower elevation, the pond at the higher elevation may be less impacted by runoff than the pond at the lower elevation. And so that's one example of degree of protection. If there are berms around surface water sources, that may protect a source of water from runoff or even from animal impact. Of course, groundwater sources are expected to be more protected than surface water sources because there's less opportunity for runoff or any other type of contaminant to enter the system. I don't know if the questioner had an opportunity to provide more clarification on the question after that, but hopefully that answers the question on protection.
It was previously required that we tested 5 times a year. Is that now just as determined by the risk assessment?
Yeah, so if water quality testing is something that the grower wants to conduct based on all of the different caveats that we went through with respect to establishing the hazards that may impact the source and distribution system of water. So again, making the determination as to whether water is safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, determining whether there's adjacent and nearby land use hazards that may be present. And if all of that decision making the outcomes of that decision making still get to a point where a grower would be able to use water quality testing to further inform that assessment, then they would make the determination with scientific justification to establish a testing frequency, a criteria, and an analyte. Now, right now, generic E. coli continues to be the indicator that is most widely used. And so if a grower is going to do water quality testing, then perhaps they're going to use generic E. coli. If the frequency and the criteria make sense based on how the grower is using that water, then we would expect the grower to use that criteria and testing frequency. But there may be time in the future where other criteria and frequencies make sense to conduct water quality testing, and that's the opportunity for including water quality testing in this assessment allows the grower to tailor the information that they're looking for to help further inform this assessment and manage the water in a way that makes sense based on the unique practices and the unique characteristics of this of their operation.
If a farm uses a well for post-harvest purposes and conducts the required testing and annual water source inspection, must they additionally conduct an AWA for that well if they choose also to use it for pre-harvest purposes too? In other words, if water passes the stricter post-harvest requirements, there is not anything more that must be done to use it pre-harvest, is there?
So just as a reminder, the assessment is a requirement for pre-harvest agricultural water and not for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water. So if the grower is conducting inspection and maintenance for this agricultural water source and distribution system, and they're ensuring that they're not using any untreated surface water for any post-harvest and harvest practices, and they ensure that the water quality doesn't change from the point of receipt to the point of use, then they may be exempt from conducting the agricultural water assessment. But again, there's a lot of nuance and caveat with how to apply the exemptions.
If we took the PSR class prior to finalization of the Ag Water Rule, do we need to be recertified with this new information for the final rule to Ag Water, or will those certification bodies update us with new information for our binders?
The training materials are going to be updated, and so the trainings would have to be updated in order to continue to meet the requirements. And so, yes, I believe so.
How can farmers who primarily utilize the generalized 1/2 log die-off rate per day between last water date and harvest date assess their risk if there's no literature for their commodity and their environmental region? Will FDA provide funding for this?
With respect to whether or not the 1/2 log per day die-off is appropriate, there may be scientific justification in the literature to show that a more appropriate die-off rate is suitable for the operation. There may be opportunities in which you could discontinue use of that water earlier in the growing season and then perhaps switch to a different water source as you get closer to the time of harvest, thereby accounting for die-off, but not necessarily relying on a specific number to say that I've used half a log per day with a max of 4 days, the way that we had finalized in the 2015 rule. We also anticipate that science supporting die-off rates on various commodities is going to develop in the future. And so we anticipate that more science will be available to growers to provide more insight on how die-off can be an appropriate mitigation measure with specific commodities in the future. Chelsea, I don't know if you want to add to that or anything.
Yeah, I was just going to build on your last point. So kind of what Crudy was saying about the approach used in 2015 is correct. And we do discuss in this final rule some of the information that was considered in developing that approach that you can then look at and see if it is or is not applicable to your situation. And one thing regarding new and future science that's coming out, and I think we were all pretty stoked to see even before the 2021 proposed rule issued, was the number of new studies that people had been working on and publishing that really tried to pull together a number of these different factors that are included in the assessment. And so looking at different crops, different regions and how that all kind of ties together in terms of resulting in that in-field die-off. So there is science available, but again, we do expect that it will continue to evolve, but there is information out there for farms to use.
Are there any examples of farm scenarios and ag water assessments? How in-depth do the assessments need to be regarding crop characteristics and intrusion?
In the preamble of the produce safety rule, there is so many examples of what growers would do in this situation. And so again, walking through an assessment is something that the grower could do using the Ag Water Assessment Builder online. That is a step-by-step process for how we would expect a grower to conduct an assessment. And then there was one other part of the question, Lauren, that I can't remember.
How does that affect intrusion?
I don't know that I'm following how the assessment affects intrusion. Does anybody else on the panel have any insight as to how that would? I'm not sure.
So crop characteristics and intrusion? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I mean, they're all kind of inherently related, right? So crop characteristics is one thing, depending on how the commodity's grown, when water's applied, that could affect whether there's kind of like infiltration as it's being grown. As far as die-off and intrusion, I'm not entirely sure on that. But just as a general matter, I mean, crop characteristics certainly do play a role in terms of commodity, like die-off on the commodity surfaces. So I think that's all kind of part of the package that we see a lot of in the science now, and as the science continues to come out.
And again, that's all referenced, in the crop characteristics section where we're talking about, there is some science out there right now, and we anticipate more to come as the thinking on crop characteristics evolves.
If the produce farm is near animal operations in adjacent land, is there a requirement of how many meters away the nearby animal operation needs to be?
For the produce safety rule requirements in the agricultural water subpart, there is no specific number of meters that a grower would need to be away from a certain hazard. And again, this goes back to this sort of comprehensive information approach. Perhaps there's something with the topography nearby that would prevent intrusion of hazards from the animal operation into a water source on farm. And that would be something to consider through this assessment, taking into account all of those evaluation factors to kind of come to this conclusion that the hazards that I've identified on farm and related to adjacent and nearby land uses may or may not pose a risk to my operation. And if they do pose a risk to my operation, I have to manage them in a way that's relevant to those specific hazards.
Going back to the question on approved sanitizers, you mentioned there's a test protocol in place. Where would a manufacturer find the protocol for approval?
Yeah, so we link it. We link on the FDA's website, and then it's also available at EPA's website. And that should be on the Ag Water webpage posting as well. It's within constituent updates and is available as its own freestanding link.
If there's no season, i.e. the operation is year round, is the assessment frequency requirement then just annual?
It would depend, right? So, I mean, it would depend on what's being grown, how water is being used, is there anything cyclic? And it would be specific to that operation. So perhaps there's, 3 seasons of lettuces, for a lack of a better example. And one uses one type of water source, another uses another type of water source, and the third uses a third different type of water source. And perhaps that assessment captures all of that information, and the assessment needs to be done only once a year. But that's, again, unique to the way that the crop is being grown, the way that the water is being used, and the way that operations kind of go on that farm. And so it's important, again, to remember that this is the assessment is a way to tailor the information that's being captured based on the unique characteristics of a farm and how the water is being used. And so it would really depend on the practices that are being done, the type of crop that's being grown, the way in which water is being used. All of that information is going to determine how frequently, at least once annually, the assessment would need to be captured.
What were the micro acceptable CFU? Was it less than 410 CFU?
For the requirements of the agricultural water subpart that we have published this past month, there are no numerical requirements for water quality testing. What we had published in 2015 was related to a geometric mean and a statistical threshold value. And I think what the question is asking is related to the statistical threshold value that we referenced of 410. But again, the requirements that have been published in May of this year, what we're talking about today, there are no numerical requirements for water quality testing.
How would a grower show scientific evidence of die-off for all their commodities? Many growers grow a wide diversity of crops, and most do not have research to guide how die-off will apply.
So the rule doesn't establish specific die-off rates, again, as we've discussed, but scientific data and information that's used to support that time interval has to be related specifically to the crop that's being grown, the geographic region, and the environment. And so when you perform an agricultural water assessment, you evaluate all those factors and then use that information to identify whether or not a die-off rate that you're finding in the literature is relevant to what you're doing. And so again, this is, kind of going back to capturing the information that's unique to your operation, and then referencing if there's anything available in the literature to support a die-off rate. And again, we anticipate that the science on die-off and the time intervals associated with in-field die-off are going to evolve in the future. And, we'll start to see more science supporting geographic regions, commodities, that sort of a thing.
In your previous webinar, you mentioned that farms couldn't test themselves out of compliance. However, the last exemption you explained, with meeting post-harvest harvest water requirements, negates that statement. Could you clarify how the new rule prevents farms from relying on testing for an exemption?
So those specific testing requirements are related only to untreated groundwater use. And so if that untreated groundwater use is being used for harvest and post-harvest activities, and then again is also used for pre-harvest activities, because remember, this assessment captures pre-harvest agricultural water that's likely to or intended to directly contact the covered portion. Then there's, again, the other nuance that, your water is safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And, making sure that those other requirements are there. You could use water that's intended for harvest and post-harvest as long as it meets those other caveats. And Chelsea, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Just to add that the kind of point about you can't test your way out of compliance, that's more about where an exemption doesn't apply. So say you have an untreated surface water source, you're doing your assessment, you're like, I'm still trying to figure out whether I need mitigation measures or not. That's just indicating that you can't rely solely on the test results to determine whether or not those mitigations are reasonably necessary. You need to look at those results within the scope of all of the other factors that you look at as part of your assessment and make your decision based on that. And there may be circumstances there where even if your test results don't exceed the criteria that you establish, if you're looking at your samples collected over times and different trends and changes, it may actually highlight some changes in water quality or a potential source of contamination that, along with the other factors, may lead you to determine that mitigations are necessary, even though the criteria that you were established that you established aren't necessarily exceeded. So it's really just kind of looking at the test results within the whole suite of information rather than as a standalone basis.
How will systems-based pre-harvest agricultural water assessments be better for protecting public health than mandated testing requirements in the previous rule?
Well, so the previous testing requirements were required regardless of how water is used, regardless of what crop is being grown, regardless of a lot of different factors that we are evaluating in this assessment. A lot of the outbreaks that happened in between the 2015 final rule publication and where we are today demonstrated that water quality testing alone cannot be an effective determinant to identify whether or not contamination has occurred. And so taking the information from this assessment alongside water quality testing when used to further inform that assessment will be more effective in managing water quality and managing the way in which water is used on farm, because testing alone can't make that determination.
All right, thanks, Curdy. And thank you to the rest of the panel today for answering all those questions. If your question did not get answered today, please use that AgWater inbox email address, and you can send those in. Also, please follow the FDA site for more information. We're going to have some upcoming AgWater webinars for the international community as well. And a recording and transcript of today's webinars will be posted on the meeting page in the near future. So thank you so much for everybody for joining, and have a great day.